Hello all, and thank you for watching my case study presentation for AES 6640 Practicum in Sports Performance Training. As a reminder, the program for this practicum was implemented in a 31-year-old male ice hockey official. Training occurred 3 to 5 times per week. Resistance training was primarily performed Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and some sprint training was performed on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Some significant findings from the initial assessment. Through one repetition maximum testing, we found that the athlete's maximal strength had actually decreased compared to his results in summer of 2021. The athlete had not been participating in a regular training program since the start of the 2021-2022 ice hockey season in the fall, and that was likely the root cause of this decreased maximal strength. In addition, the athlete expressed a goal of improving overhead mobility for clearer ice hockey officiating signals, as well as a desire to improve upper body strength in order to better intervene in altercations. Some ways in which the program specifically addressed the findings of these assessments. We focused a fair amount of our resistance training on bilateral sagittal barbell training, so things like overhead presses, squats, deadlifts, and hang cleans, as opposed to accessory exercises, since we identified that maximal strength was a weak point in this athlete. Also, I included more overhead pressing exercises compared to what would be prescribed for a traditional ice hockey player, as this is probably a more functionally relevant movement for officials compared to players. How does research support the program design? There were 3 very specific exercises that were selected that I believe are backed by the research for inclusion in this population. The first is targeted hip adductor strengthening exercises. Research has shown that weak hip adductors can predict injury in ice hockey players when the adductors are weak relative to the abductors, and research has also shown that targeted strengthening programs for the adductors can reduce this risk. In addition, sprint training included a fair amount of backward sprinting. First of all, this is functionally relevant for ice hockey officials who spend a great deal of time skating backwards in order to maintain an adequate field of view of the play. It has also been shown in research that the inclusion of backward sprinting may improve speed and power measures better than a program that is only based in forward sprinting. And finally, the power phase of this athlete's program included hang cleans, which have been shown to have a high degree of dynamic correspondence with skating starts in ice hockey. Some of the adaptations that were experienced by the client were an increase in maximal strength as measured by one repetition maximum testing, faster 20-meter sprint times during sprint training, and the athlete also reported decreased RPE during while officiating games, as well as a subjective improvement in decision making. That feeling of improved decision making is likely due to reduced physiological stress during games, allowing the athlete to focus more on decisions rather than the physiological stress of simply keeping up with the game. Some things that I learned from this experience. First of all, assessments need to be relevant and useful. For example, we used 1RM testing to identify the athlete's 1 rep max, which was used because we used percentage-based training to prescribe intensity for each training session. So had we used something like velocity-based training, this would probably have not been necessary. In the assessments, we also did a 1.5-mile run to identify conditioning deficits. But given the fact that we eliminated the conditioning from the program due to possible overtraining, this was probably not a relevant assessment looking back on it. I also learned the importance of understanding all stressors that an athlete is experiencing. Things like acute injury, travel, poor sleep can all affect an athlete's adaptation and ability to train, as well as that athlete's performance level. And we as coaches, specifically performance coaches, cannot impact all of these stressors. We can only respond and change what we're applying in the weight room in response to those stressors. And finally, it's important to remember that while there are certain principles of physiological adaptation, athletes are not robots. Just because we program stressor A does not mean the athlete will automatically show adaptation B. Athlete development is often non-linear, and it is important to remember that we're training the individual athlete. It's athlete-specific training, not necessarily sport-specific training. Some of the greatest challenges, as I've discussed previously in discussion posts, the athlete experienced acute injuries to the upper heels as a result of improperly installed rivets on the tendon guard at the back of the ice hockey skates. This impacted the athlete's ability to focus during games, impacted skating speed, as well as desire to train. Once this issue was corrected, however, many of these qualities came back. Early on, we saw fatigue and possible overtraining during the stabilization phase. This was probably due to too much volume, and I would say that for future programs, I would eliminate the conditioning training during this phase for in-season athletes, as I think that contributed to overtraining. I would replace that with some high-intensity and very low-volume sprint training. Finally, one of the challenges was simply finding the time to complete training sessions while incorporating long rest periods. As I've mentioned in discussion posts, we incorporated relatively long rest periods in order to focus on maximal strength, but that also made the training sessions much longer, which can be difficult to incorporate into somebody's daily life. Some things I learned about implementing integrated training programs. It's important to remember that integrated means that we're considering all of the stimuli that an athlete is experiencing. As I mentioned, things like sleep, life stress, school, injury, games, travel, etc. It's not just about the stressors that we are applying to the athlete in the weight room. There is no one-size-fits-all program. You cannot simply take the NASM OPT model for hockey players and apply it to all hockey players and all officials. You have to understand the needs and goals and readiness to train of the specific athlete that you are working with. And finally, I found it necessary sometimes to modify things like intensity, volume, or exercise selection during individual training sessions based on the athlete's current readiness to train. Some ways to improve for the future. As I've mentioned, I would eliminate conditioning training during the competitive season as it likely contributed to overtraining. I would increase the focus on power and speed, as these are two buckets that are probably not being filled just by officiating a large number of games, while low to moderate intensity conditioning probably is being satisfied simply by officiating games. Related to that, I would focus on reducing volume and increasing intensity. And finally, I would focus on taking a more holistic approach to all of the stressors that the athlete is experiencing. A practical way to implement that would be something as simple as a pre-training questionnaire to ask about the athlete's fatigue level, stress level, sleep quality, etc. Here is the reference section for some of the references cited in this presentation, and thank you so much for watching.